The U.S. military has Directive 1315.15, the sole survivor policy. It was created after a tragic shipwreck of the USS Juneau in 1942, where an entire family of 5 brothers died when their boat was struck by a torpedo. This law is still in effect today, and there have been people throughout history who have actually used this law. It's meant to pass on the family genealogy. That if you get down to only one of the sons in the family being alive, that son's to be sent home to continue on that family lineage. And this rule most notably was used in World War II when only one of the 4 Lillian brothers was believed to be alive. This was the inspiration, the Lillian brothers, for the movie Saving Private Ryan. And there's a scene in Saving Private Ryan where Captain Tom Hanks, he's played by Tom Hanks, he's been searching all over for Private Ryan. He was a trooper that jumped out of a plane. They have no clue where he's at. These losing members, he's about to have a mutiny. They're like, why are we going on this mission? And they find Private Ryan, who is played by, let me think of his name here, Matt Damon. And Private Ryan is thinking about this feeling of unworthiness, this luck that he should be able to go home and live, this maybe sort of divine providence that is saving him from this terrible war where everyone was dying. In the captain's last words in the movie, Tom Hanks says to Matt Damon, "Make it count. Make it count." Everyone else dies, but for him, it's this gift. So he says, "Make it count." And at the end of the movie, Private Ryan brings all of his family, his extended family, to the graves. And they're looking for the captain's grave. They find the grave, and he falls down weeping. He says, "I hope I made it count. I hope I made it count." And this is precisely where we find ourselves today in the book of Ruth. We've been seeking to answer the question, does God see me? Because in our hardest seasons in life, it's often our biggest questions. Ruth is a foreign widow who is barren from a foreign land, and the bottom line is she has the lowest social status in Israel. Naomi is about to lose her entire family lineage, and for many in the history of the world, this is just commonplace. This is what the world is like. It can be a terrible place to live, especially for women. Hindu communities have a practice of burning the widow at the stake of her husband's grave because they're saying it would be as good as her to be dead than to go on living without him. In places of the world today, if a daughter is born, they throw her on the garbage heap because they're seeking to find a son. In fact, when we consider all these atrocities happening and have happened in our world today, it is interesting to understand that these were all happening around Israel. That the countries and the gods around them were requiring these detestable acts of them. So the question we ask when we come to this book, when we come to the end of Ruth, is, well, what about God? What about the God of Israel? Is the God of Israel like all these other gods in the world, or is this God different? And so God seeks to answer these questions we have in the book of Ruth. See, we have seen that this story is about food. It's about God providing, and as Jim pointed out, we like our food here at this church. So God is bringing them out of this winter season in life. He's brought them into a spring season, but picking up on chapter 3, Ruth and Naomi requested, we don't want to just live in this spring season. We want a summer season. And so we've been waiting. We've been waiting to see what God will do with this. Pray with me as the story concludes. God, this morning I come requesting that you would open our eyes and ears to see how you differ from all the other gods in this world. Because it's June. Summer is here. May we come to understand the new life and the new family you are inviting us into, and may we have the courage to live into it. Pour through me the gift of preaching, that the faith of Ruth will grow in our hearts. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen. So at the end of the last chapter of chapter 3, Naomi and Ruth are waiting for Boaz to work. And sometimes it is hard to count on people. But Naomi has a positive outlook on it. She says in chapter 3 these lines, "The man will not rest until the matter is settled today." Today. So in order to settle this matter, Boaz must go to the city gate. And before I read about his actions at the city gate, it's helpful to understand what the city gate is actually like, because there's a big social significance for it. The city gate had several functions. First, it was kind of the center of everything going on in the town, where commerce and networking took place, the social status. It was also like kind of a civic center where you could do something like change your name or go to the Justice of Peace or go to the DMV. They would process those kind of things here, but it went quicker than it did in American terms, I'm guessing. But most of all, it was the courthouse. It was the judicial system. It's where it took place. The elders served as the justices for the town of sorts, making rulings. So knowing all this, let's pick up in chapter 4. Meanwhile, Boaz went up to the town and gate and sat down there just as the guardian redeemer he had mentioned came along. Boaz said, "Come over here, my friend, and sit down." So he went over and sat down. Boaz took 10 of the elders of the town and said, "Sit here," and they did so. Then he said to the guardian redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest you buy it in the presence of these seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, do so. But if you will not, tell me, so I will know. For no one has the right to do it except you, and I am the next in line." "I will redeem it," he said. Then Boaz said, "On the day you buy the land from Naomi, you also acquire Ruth, the Moabite, the dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property." At this, the guardian redeemer said, "Then I cannot redeem it because it might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself. I cannot do it." Now, in earlier times in Israel, for the redemption and transfer of their property to become final, one party took off his sandal and gave it to the other. This was the method of legalizing the transaction in Israel. So the guardian redeemer said to Boaz, "Buy it yourself," and he removed his sandal. Then Boaz announced to the elders and all the people, "Today you are my witnesses, that I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Kilion, and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabite, Mahlon's widow, as my wife in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from his hometown. Today you are my witnesses." Then the elders and all the people at the gate said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the family of Israel. May you have standing in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. Through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman, may your family be like that of Perez, who Tamar bore to Judah." So let's go through this a little bit. Boaz is sitting at the city gate. And sure enough, who shows up? The kinsman redeemer, the one closest in line to inheriting this land. And so we might ask, what are the odds? Or we might say, is this divine providence at work here? And do you notice how Boaz sets up the situation? He's wiser than the craftiest attorney. Throughout Ruth, I keep showing you over and over again these two laws, Leviticus chapter 19 and Deuteronomy chapter 24. If we could show them to everyone there, Steve. Because one of the themes of the book of Ruth is how will God's perfect law, the laws he made for them, how is this to be lived out? What will this look like in the world today? And we're not told in the book of Ruth the status of Elimelech's land. It could just be sitting there. Some people could be working it. They could be renting it in some sort. It probably was in some maybe kind of state of foreclosure. But there's these laws where someone can redeem it. They can buy back this family land. And so this unnamed redeemer is like, well, I'll do it. Well, why? Because it's good for the redeemer. He gets to expand his land. Good things happen to his land. Good to see you, Simon. And Simon's an old friend. He's a good guy. Ask him how it's going at Harding when we're done. So, anyways, there's good reason for the kinsman redeemer to want this land. Okay? And it would add to his family estate. It would help his family security. It's a really good thing. And then Boaz hits him with the punchline. The catch. Well, you can buy it, but also you get a widow and you get Naomi, the bitter mother-in-law, and he's like, at this, I'm out. Okay? Now, there's more of a practical reason. He said my family would be in danger. Probably finances would have been a little tight. It would have been more mouths to feed. But also the danger is, if Ruth the Moabite were to have a son, the son gets that land. So he's buying all this land, and he might be raising it up for someone else, and it's not supporting his sons. It becomes a complicated situation. So Boaz's negotiating skills shine. He's like, I'll do it. I'll take the land. They sign the contract by exchanging a sandal. Weird practice to me. It must have been a Chaco. Those are worth some money nowadays. And after the contract is done, notice how the elders respond. I already told you the context of the countries around them. Come on in, Luke. Good to see you. Luke's a good wrestler, guys. And all the countries around him are like, these women, they're throwing them on heaps. They're getting rid of them. And the elders give a blessing. They're like, this foreign Moabite woman, make her like Rachel and Leah. Who are they? They're the matriarchs. They're the ones who together helped build. All these people are ancestors of these two women. It's this huge blessing that God would build up this house together. And the elders are hoping for a summer season. A blessing of a summer season for Ruth and Naomi, where they don't have to just survive, but they get to thrive in life. It is a statement that shows how much they value the women in ancient Israel, which is much more positive than the countries around them. And watch what happens next. After all this takes place, hear the rest of the story. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. The woman said to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." Then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. The women there said, "Naomi has a son," and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. The 2 women asked to be redeemed. And if you remember in the chapters before, they wondered, does God see me? Is God going to reject me? Is God punishing me for my sins? Has God left me all alone? And here we find at the end of the story that God's been working all along. God's been lining all these things up to provide for them. And so Ruth, for her first 10 years in marriage to her first husband, could never conceive. Yet the Lord works in the wombs of women. And God gave her a son, which isn't as significant to Ruth as it is to Naomi, because to Naomi this means she has a family again. She has a family lineage again. And the real miracle in all of this is that Ruth lets Naomi help raise the baby. I mean, did they agree on a parenting style? Like, how do you think that worked out? Yet going deeper, the chapter or the book started out with everyone gossiping about Ruth and Naomi when they came in. Why has God cursed them? What is God doing to them? And how does the book close? With all the women in town exalting them and talking about their faith and talking about how God has blessed them. The irony is that in a male-driven culture they found themselves in, is that the people in the town pointed out that Ruth the Moabite is more valuable than 7 sons. 7 is the biblical number of perfections. 7 sons would be the ultimate insurance policy, because in a difficult world, in a difficult time to live, that at least one of these would be able to provide for you and take care of you. But that doesn't add up to Ruth, because Ruth's unwavering faith takes action in every chapter of the book. And in every chapter of the book, God provides for them until this huge climax and crescendo in the end when God gives her a son. And yet there's a Paul Harvey moment in this. You know the rest of the story? The rest of the story is, why would Boaz care for a Moabite widow? See, the genealogy at the end of the book of Ruth tries to explain it to us, but we miss it because we only see the men. So Matthew, in the first chapter, in the first book, in the New Testament, explains it like this. Salmon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Boaz's mother was Rahab the prostitute from Jericho. Rahab was a foreigner. Her story is found in the first chapters of Joshua. See, all the Israelites were to enter into the promised land, and they were pretty terrified. They're like, they've got these fortified cities and castles, and they're big people. What do we do? And they send these spies in, and Rahab is like, I have heard about your God, and I want to align myself with your God. She hides the spies. She takes care of them. So Boaz, growing up, must have heard these stories from Mom. Mom must have said, son, I have to tell you what it was like when 7 times Israel's army marched around the walls. They blew their trumpets and all the walls of Jericho, besides ours, became tumbling down. That's what God did for us. But more importantly, hearing these stories over and over again must have built some kind of faith in Boaz. Some kind of faith to live out the laws of God. Remember in the book of Judges, in the times where there was no king, when no one was taking care of them, when no one was ruling them, Boaz still had this faith. But more importantly, when Boaz sees a foreign woman showing great faith in the God of Israel, he admires it, I'm guessing because it reminds him of his mother. And you know what they say, you marry someone like your mom, so I guess Boaz resembles that statement. But more importantly, the book of Ruth answers the law of Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 3, which says a Moabite could not worship in the assembly for 10 generations. What's the reason for this law? Was it to keep certain races and cultures excluded? Was it to exclude certain people groups? Well, the end of Ruth gives us the answer to this law. 10 generations of Ruth's family are listed at the very end of the book of Ruth. I'm not going to read it for you because those names are hard to pronounce. So the answer is it has nothing to do with skin type or nationality, and it has everything to do with faith. The reason God would want to keep those Moabites out and other nations out was to keep their pagan worship practices out. They had horrific acts of worship, which included weird sexual practices and human sacrifice. God did not want that in his worship to him. So, however, Ruth had a different kind of faith. Her continual commitment to the God of Israel not only qualified her to worship in the assembly, but it also placed her as the great-great-grandmother of the king of Israel. Generations later, there would be a young shepherd boy. He would be the youngest of his brothers, sent out to deliver food to his brothers sitting on the front line. And every day they would hear from this bully, these Philistines who would come out and mock them. And they would send their giant out, Goliath, and say, "Who do you have to fight me?" And we wonder to ourselves, how could this shepherd boy have had the faith to stand up against this giant? Well, could you imagine what it was like for David to sit around the campfire with his grandpa Obed and to hear story after story of how God provided and took care and sustained his family? When God saw Goliath, or when David saw Goliath, David did not see Goliath's size. David marveled at the size of David's God. If David's God could split the seas and they could walk on dry land, if he could bring down the walls of Jericho, if he could provide for his great-great-grandmother, then Goliath is just an ant compared to the size of David's God. And so David had the faith to believe that God would do the same thing for him as he did for generations before him. So when Saul tried to kill David, and when David's own son tried to overtake his kingdom, David knew the story of his great-grandmother Ruth, who even in her most difficult winter seasons in life still went out to glean in the field. Many of David's hardest psalms reflect this faith. After David's failures and mistakes, David knew about his great-great-great-grandmother, Naomi, who remembered of God's goodness and returned home where God would provide bread for her. See, the story of Ruth was not an intellectual exercise for David. Instead, it was his family story being lived out. And so this sermon is not an intellectual exercise for you either. If all you hear is something thought-provoking, I've failed this morning. If your only takeaway is to say, "Oh, well, that's a good sermon," then it was all for naught. The reason the Bible is preached is so we'd live it. That despite the weaknesses of all the people recorded in this Bible, all the people in this story, it is recorded so that we will see the faith they have and we would in turn emulate it in our lives. And living that out makes for a good sermon. But here's why it gets even better as we get ready to close. Maybe you've heard of Christmas in July. Well, I'm about to bring you Christmas in June. Because about 1,000 years later, after Ruth and Boaz, that's triple the age of America. 1,000 years later, a new foreign occupier was on the scene in Israel. It was Rome, and they wanted a census, so they had everyone go back to their hometown. And there was a woman named Mary who followed her husband David to his hometown of Bethlehem. Her husband Joseph was from the line of David. These people we read about today, Ruth and Boaz, were his ancestors. And there was no room for the two of them, so they had to sleep in a barn where Mary went into labor. She delivered, and instead of placing the newborn baby in a crib, they had to place the baby in a feeding trough called a manger. And on the surface, it seems like the most insignificant birth in the history of the world. But angels showed up. singing to shepherds. Wise men a couple years later would show up giving gifts. Even the cosmos knew something was happening because there was a star over the little town of Bethlehem. Because Bethlehem means the house of bread, and the bread of life was born in Bethlehem. And we all desperately needed this birth. Because we've all been Ruth and Naomi at one way or another in our lives. You see, the reason Jesus came was to be our Boaz. I've been waiting 4 weeks to tell you this news. The hint of the book of Ruth is in the word kinsman redeemer. The first word is all about family. Remember, Naomi longed for a family, and she wanted to have this family, and Ruth and Boaz made that possible for her. See, God knew that us Gentiles, that we needed a family too. And so God sent a son. They called him Jesus, and he left his home in heaven. And while on earth, he did outrageous, generous acts of love so that we could be part of his family. There's just one problem. We've all been like Elimelech in our own way. We've all run away from home. We haven't trusted when we should have trusted that God would provide for us. In the end, we mess up and we find ourselves in the messes that Ruth and Naomi found themselves in. So the second half of the phrase is redeemer. A redeemer means to be set free by paying a price. Boaz was Ruth's redeemer because he gave out of his wealth to purchase Ruth's family lineage and provide for her and give her security and hope and a future. Jesus purchases his bride with his own life of giving of himself. See, one of the images of the church is as the bride of Christ. And to understand what it means to be the bride of Christ, you must first understand the book of Ruth. Because in Ruth chapter 4, verse 10, maybe you caught this, Boaz, he is marrying Ruth in order to maintain the name of the dead. Jesus walked out of the tomb to do the same thing for you and me. So I don't know about all you. I don't have much of a family pedigree. In elementary school, my brother was really into family pedigrees. I'm adopted, my brother's biological, and he was really excited to find out about all these things. So the closest we have to being related to anyone famous is on my dad's side of the family, way down the line. They're related to Stonewall Jackson. He was a general in the Confederate Army. And since I'm not biological, my little brother told me I'm not allowed to be related to him. Which I replied back with, guess what? Stonewall was the loser. I don't want to be related to him anyways. And I knew it would pay off one day, but it took about 30 years, and sure enough, in 2020, old Stonewall got canceled, and all his statues got torn down. So it looks like I made the right choice all along. I'm not related to him. Because you see, in the end, there's only one family I want to be related to. And we see it in Matthew, in the first chapter, which is the genealogy of Jesus. Let me give you just this short piece of it. Solomon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the father of King David. It is more fortunate to be connected to this family lineage than any of the sole survivors in the history of our country. Better to be found in this family to be that of Private Ryan. And so in our faith journey, the journey of God being our kinsman redeemer, we find ourselves in different places, but all needing to respond in some way. So for some of us, we might find ourselves in Ruth chapter 1, needing to return home to God, even though we've never been home before, to repent, to be baptized. For others, it is having the faith to press ahead, even when we're in winter seasons in life, knowing and trusting that God will provide for us, even when all odds seem to be against us. And still for others, it's trusting that God will lead us into deeper seasons. That he'll take us from spring seasons into summer seasons where we will flourish in life. But for most of us today, there's a greater challenge. There's a greater growth we need to have to no longer identify with Ruth and Naomi, but to start living like Boaz. Because Boaz didn't have to do anything he does in the book of Ruth. In fact, it comes at great cost for him. Great to his family line, to his wealth, to all the work, to all the food he gave for her. Great expense, but he does it all to gain a family. His gain was adding to the family of God. Jesus says it's better to serve than to be served. Can we grow to the point of spiritual maturity that it's no longer about us, but it's about how we can be Boaz to those in the world hurting today? Pray with me as we conclude our study on the book of Ruth. God, thank you. Thank you for being our Boaz. Thank you for giving us a greater family to belong to. Thank you for redeeming us. So today, help us not just to hear your words, but to live them out, to implement them in our lives. Find us where we are at and lead us to take the next steps in our journey with you. And I pray all this. Pray all this in the name of our kinsman redeemer, Jesus. It's in his name that I pray. Amen.